Today, we are doing something that one might think is a bad idea. We are painting up an Imperial Fist. And no, it's not the fact that Imperial Fists are unnecessarily proud, therefore requiring the paint job to be perfect. Instead, the issue is that we're painting up the Imperial Fist using these. These, for lack of a better word, are cheap acrylic paints. And what we did is we picked up a couple boxes. So we've got 12 standard acrylic paints, as well as a box of 12 metallic paints. Equally, we also picked up a small pack of neon paints. And those, along with some really cheap brushes that we've also picked up, is what we're going to be using to paint today's model. Kicking off the project, we will need to start by laying down our armor color. In this case, we can grab the yellow from our range, which just so happens to be a very vivid, bright lemon yellow. This yellow can be applied over all of the armor sections. This model has been based and primed using a very heavy white zenithal. This makes it a lot easier for us because we have less work to make the top surface from a white to a yellow, needing to take only 2 or 3 coats. As we've essentially gone round and applied our brightest coat first, naturally we are now going to need to come in and start shading. To achieve the shading, what we're going to do is grab a yellow ochre, and then we can thin this down into almost a wash consistency, applying this across the model's armor, helping to add a second tone within the shadow areas as well as the recesses. It's worth highlighting that from this point I've now decided that this project isn't going to go as I expected. And you might be thinking, well, obviously it's because of the cheap paints. Well, actually these paints are, as you may have noticed from previous footage, are quite thick, which is nice because we have a wide range of area that we can go in and dilute to make glazes and washes and things like that. The issue being that the consistency and the amount of pigment in ratio to the other things like binder seems to be slightly less, making it harder to get complete coverage in the same way we might with normal paint. But that isn't even the thing that's actually been the main problem on this project. Let's see if you can work out what that might be in a moment. With our recesses shaded with the ochre, we can start to build up a little bit more intense shadow by taking a darker brown from the options, in this case a sienna, mixed with a small amount of our initial yellow. This will become our shadow tone. What we want to do is build up across a couple of thinned layers of this mix, trying to imagine where the light would hit the armor, and then essentially painting the inverse of those areas, so that we are catching all the areas where light wouldn't be. Once we've got our shadows placed, we're essentially going to need to smooth out some of the harsh lines that may appear. And the way we're going to do that is essentially working backwards through what we've just done. So as opposed to going from our light yellow down to our shadow, we're going to be working from our shadow all the way back up through to our light color. In this case, we want to go back and grab the ochre that we used for our recess shading, and then apply a thin coat of this across the 2 color sections between the shadow and the bright yellow. This will help to mask out that sharp change from the shadow to the light. But we can help this out a little bit more. What we can then do is move on to our yellow and apply a coat of this, starting from the transition point of our ochre onto our yellow, making sure to be pulling from the shadowy area up to the brightest point. This far in, you may have worked out what the main problem on this project I'm having is. And no, it's not the cheap paint, as we mentioned. It is the cheap brushes. These brushes, yes, are not aimed at hobbyists at all. I've used cheap brushes, I've used expensive brushes, and these are generally just bad brushes. Potentially useful if you were going to be using them on something like basing or painting a larger model like a knight. But there is no such thing as a tip anywhere near any of these brushes. They don't maintain any form of point, and there are stray hairs absolutely everywhere. Obviously, I know that these aren't miniature painting brushes, and most even basic rudimentary miniature painting brushes would be better than these. But if you happen to be stuck with the option of picking it up from a hobby store that isn't one of our hobby stores and is more of just a general artsy store without a lot of artsy supplies, just avoid these. Honestly, unless you're basing on knights, I probably wouldn't even suggest looking at them. Now that I've covered my biggest gripe on the project, let's jump back to the painting. To help evidence my point on these brushes, let's try and use the smallest brush that we have, which came from the pack titled as Detail Brushes. This brush was used for pretty much the rest of the model, starting with the red and picking out all of the various details across the model. In this case, that was the faceplate, the emblem, and any of the laurels. Then we have all of the black areas, and these got, believe it or not, a coat in black. Carefully working round, subscribing to the channel, and getting a clean black coat on all of the trims and weapons. We will be highlighting the reds, mixing in a little orange to the red at the end until we have a slightly lighter red, but not so far that we're hitting actual orange, and then very carefully trying to catch any of the raised details. Quickly jumping back, there are a couple of bits on this that we're not going to be doing in this video. That mainly being the purity seal as well as the eye lenses. The purity seal was essentially painted up using the same colours, going from the brown, mixing in a white until we got to a papery style. Then we had the eye lenses, nice and simple, we just slapped some green on the lenses for a little bit of a contrast in colour to the red face. Finally, we're now going to be moving on to the more fun paints that I was actually looking forward to when I discovered these. And that is this set of 12 different metallic paints. All of the general metals can start from essentially the same place. And by this I mean things like the gun, the pack vents, and things like the halo. In this set, there happens to be a black metal, which we can use to base everything that we want metal, so that even our darkest shadows have a little bit of a shine to them. Then what we can do is start layering up. The first layer is going to be using a gold or bronze, and this can be lightly overbrushed across all of the metal areas to help add that golden hue to the metal. Then, for certain elements, we can go a step further, grabbing a silver and then using this to cover all of the areas quite broadly that we want in a silver as opposed to a gold. This gives us an array of metal tones relatively quickly without a lot of work. Then for fun, what we also did is we went and grabbed the coloured metal, so the red metal, and then used this for the name plaque on the Marine's shoulder. There is just one bit that I wanted to quickly jump in and throw some numbers back out there. These paints came in sets of 12 for a total of £5 each, which means we got 24 paints for a total of £10, or the equivalent in whatever country you're converting that into. And what that means is we have a lot more paint than we could get from Games Workshop. So all of these have the same amount of paint per tube as this pot of paint, except this pot costs £3. So what we're actually looking at for the price of the £10 of paints that we got, we could probably get around 3 Games Workshop paints instead of the 24 paints that we got from the shop. Obviously, if we throw in the additional extra things that we got, like the ultimately hated brushes that came to a total of £5 for around 12 brushes, then it's even better and maybe you get 5 paints. But to be honest, I'm not going to go into these brushes anymore. I've detailed why I hate them, and this is the reason why I think this paint job became more of an impressionistic approach to painting as opposed to some sort of detailed approach. While at the shop picking up the equipment for this video, we also picked up a few neon paints, and some of those are going to be used on this model. In total, there are 3 neon colours that we're going for. We have neon green, neon orange, and neon yellow. Starting with the yellow, as I imagine you can foresee, we are going to be using thin coats of this to boost the brightest sections of our yellow armour. This is what will essentially be acting as our final highlight for all of the yellow sections. To be honest, at this point, I would really like to say edge highlighting, but you know, brushes. This is the same with the other 2 colours. For example, with the orange that was used, we took a little bit of our red and mixed that into the orange, giving us a bright poppy colour, which we can then go through and use to highlight all of the key red elements. That's things like the chest emblem, the weapons, and the tabard. Whereas for things like the green, we essentially use these just to give the eyes a slight pop of colour. Once we've done all that, we can essentially pop the model together, build out a really nice simple base, and then get the model into the photo booth. We will have the photos up in a moment. But just quickly, as I said earlier, there is a big price difference between the paints and things that we're using here versus Games Workshop. So if we include the big pots of neon paint that we also used for this project, we spent around £15 on 30 paints, so roughly 50p a paint, versus the roughly £3 a paint from Games Workshop. So that means that if we were to swap all of the paints out, you could probably pick up 5 Games Workshop paints. Obviously, we'll ignore the brushes. They don't exist. We assume you've got your own brushes. The question I want to ask you, and hopefully you'll be able to see the models now, would you probably lean more towards having 30 cheaper paints for the £15, or would you buy 5 Games Workshop paints, for example, or any other model paint range, and then just buy the 5 colours you need for your army and make more mixes, as opposed to having a wider range of cheaper paints? So to be honest, I'm kind of mixed. I thought I was not going to really enjoy this, and I think there is actually some good use in these cheaper paints. I actually quite like the metallics, especially the coloured metallics, so I might need to try these out a little bit more. I'm not going to talk about the brushes anymore, but the paints, if you're interested in giving it a go and you have a little bit of spare money and you can afford to pick it up, if you enjoy it, it's actually quite a good deal because you do get a lot of paint for your money. It's just whether or not you're willing to work with the hassle of it. Personally, despite the fact that I was using terrible brushes, I quite like how this model came out. And obviously, for you to be able to compare this to something painted with, like Citadel paints, for example, you need to see models painted in Citadel paints, which you can do by clicking this video here. Just remember to comment in one of these videos which one you prefer more. Otherwise, you are going to need to subscribe so that we can see you next time.